A week ago, I released a video where I tested this Satechi dock for the Mac Mini. The dock is a super smart way to get more storage for your Mac, while also adding some ports that the Mini is missing. Because in addition to the SD card reader and the 3 USB-A ports, you can install an NVMe SSD of up to 4 terabytes directly in the bottom of the dock, so that by using just one port on your Mac Mini, you get both an external hard drive and extra inputs for your computer. But unfortunately, I experienced some critical errors when I tried to use the SSD I had installed in the enclosure. Files suddenly became unreadable or disappeared completely, and when I tried to repair the disk, the errors were so severe that it couldn't be saved. I found a thread on Reddit about problems using Kingston SSDs in the dock, and that was exactly what I had installed. To investigate whether there's any truth to this, or if the dock is just a bad idea in general, I've gotten hold of an SSD from another brand that Satechi themselves recommend on their website. I'll install that one instead, and then I'll test it extra thoroughly to make sure it works without any issues. To take it a step further, I've also bought a Thunderbolt 5 enclosure like this, where I'll install the 4 terabyte SSD from Kingston that was giving me errors. To see if there's a general problem with Kingston SSDs on Mac, as some people claim, or if it's just in the Satechi dock that you should avoid them. In a comment on the previous video, it was suggested that I also test the Wi-Fi speed with and without the dock connected, and that I measure the temperature of the new NVMe SSD inside the dock while it's in use. So those tests are also included in this video. To thoroughly test the new SSD's integrity and stability so I can make sure it works without issues, I've installed a command line tool called F3 on my Mac. It's specifically designed to run a read-write test on the SSD to ensure it doesn't lie about its capacity and to check that data written to the drive can also be read back without errors. It has to be run via text commands in the Mac's terminal program, so it's not exactly user-friendly, but on the other hand, it can fill the disk with files and then validate them and report whether all data can be read without problems, and if not, how much data has been lost. I first ran a test on the Kingston SSD that I originally installed in the dock. It took about 12 hours to fill it up because the write speed kept getting slower and slower, but eventually it was filled with 3,722 files, each a little over 1 gigabyte. So now I could run the validation. Just as I had experienced in my original test, there were errors on the disk from the start. 135.83 megabytes had been lost. That might not sound like much out of the 4 million megabytes that can be stored on the disk in total, but you have to remember that just a single wrong bit in a file, no matter how large that file is, can potentially make the entire file unusable. For example, if it's a video file, at best you'll experience dropouts or errors in individual frames, and at worst, you'll end up with a file that can no longer be played, which is exactly what happened to me. When I tested the dock for the first time, the errors got worse after I'd unmounted the disk and after I'd restarted the computer. So I started by disconnecting the drive and then reconnecting it, and then I ran the validation one more time. And now over 1,000 megabytes had been lost. After restarting the computer, yet another validation revealed that an additional 13 megabytes on the disk had been corrupted. I also tried running the disk utility's first aid function to see if I could repair the drive, but it failed completely and recommended that I back up the data on the drive if possible. Unfortunately, now the drive wouldn't mount at all, so there was nothing more I could do. At least now I had once again confirmed that the Kingston SSD was indeed unusable, and that my testing method could correctly identify the problems with the disk. So I removed the SSD from the dock and instead installed this crucial P3 Plus SSD, which my channel sponsor so generously had donated for the test. An SSD that Satechi lists as compatible on their own website. I then connected the dock and started running the same tests once again. After the drive was completely filled, I ran the validation, and fortunately, it didn't show any errors at all. So it seemed that the Kingston SSD really was the problem. But of course, one test is no guarantee, so I did as I had with the Kingston SSD. I unmounted the drive and reconnected it. And then I ran the test once more. And again, no errors. I restarted the computer and ran the test a third time, and once again, I got a perfect validation with no errors. Disk Utility also reported that the drive was working fine when I ran first aid on it, and when I ran the test a fourth time afterwards, the result was the same. All files could be read and no data was lost. So it really was true that the Kingston SSD was the problem. Now that the new SSD was working without any issues, I ran Blackmagic's disk speed test for over 20 minutes to stress it as much as possible, and then I measured the temperature of the SSD. I ran the test with the dock placed under the Mac Mini, and after about 22 minutes, I tilted the computer onto its side and removed the cover to the SSD while letting the test continue running. And then I measured its surface temperature. The hottest spot I could find was 62.1 degrees. I also measured the temperature after the drive hadn't been in use for a while, and here the temperature at the hottest spot was about 40 degrees. The crucial SSD is rated for a maximum of 70 degrees and should preferably stay below 65 according to the documentation, so it looks like it's within the recommended values. As mentioned, there have also been reports that the Wi-Fi on the Mac Mini gets slower when the dock is attached. So, of course, I tested that as well. I ran a speed test 3 times without the dock attached and 3 times with it. And to my great surprise, the speed was highest in all the tests where the dock was attached. I thought that seemed a bit strange, so I ran the test again 3 times both with and without the dock, but again the result was the same. When the Mac Mini was on the dock, the speed was simply higher in all the tests. I don't know if it could have something to do with where your router is placed in relation to the computer, but in my tests, I couldn't detect any degradation. On the contrary, as I mentioned at the beginning, I also went out and bought this UGREEN Thunderbolt 5 enclosure because I also bought and paid for the Kingston SSD myself, so I wasn't keen on just letting it go to waste. It was a bit of a gamble because what if the Kingston SSD didn't work in this enclosure either? But nothing ventured, nothing gained, as they say. So I took the chance and installed the SSD in the enclosure. I then tried to run the same F3 test as before, but got read errors as soon as I tried to run the validation. Things weren't looking too good, but fortunately the error had nothing to do with the data, and after a bit of research I found out that it was an input-output error that can occur in some enclosures during the specific test I used. So instead I used a completely manual method. I simply copied a bunch of files to and from the drive, and then checked afterwards that they still worked and could be read. I also ran Disk Utility's first aid function several times, and each time it completed without any issues. I've now been using the disk for little over a week, and I've also used it for video editing, and I still haven't experienced any problems, so fortunately for me, it looks like the Kingston SSD works perfectly fine in the new enclosure. And since I have a Mac Mini with an M4 Pro, it has Thunderbolt 5 ports on the back, so I can also take advantage of the extra speed that the enclosure allows for. And that's quite obvious when I run speed tests on the drive. In some tests, like the write speed here, it's actually faster than the built-in hard drive in my Mac Mini. But to return to the Satechi dock, after all these tests, the conclusion is that it works as intended and delivers on its promises. As long as you make sure to stick to an SSD from one of the brands that Satechi recommends on their website. I've therefore included a link to the page down in the description so you can see for yourself which ones they are. The temperature of the built-in SSD also appears to be within the recommended values, and as for Wi-Fi, there are no issues there either. When it comes to the Kingston SSD, fortunately, it also seems to work just fine in the new enclosure. But unless you have a Mac Mini with the M4 Pro and need a very fast SSD, you really don't need the UGREEN enclosure here. It costs almost twice as much as the Satechi dock, and by the way, has a built-in fan that makes quite a bit of noise when the drive is under load. And of course, it doesn't add any extra ports to your Mac. But at least you can't complain about the speed. That might have been a bit nerdy, but I think it was important to clarify what the problem was. So you can avoid making the same mistake I did, and so I can recommend the Satechi dock with a clear conscience. It turns out it's actually a really good solution, as long as you stick to one of the approved SSDs. If you'd like to see more from my YouTube channel, well, YouTube has another video ready right there. And if you'd like to support the channel directly, I'm always happy for a cup of coffee. See you soon!